October 16th, 1942, 18,000 feet above Stalingrad. Senior Lieutenant Alexander Pokryshkin squinted through the cramped cockpit of his Bell P-39 Airacobra, watching German Messerschmitt Bf-109s circling below like sharks sensing blood. The Soviet ace had heard all the stories. American and British pilots called his aircraft a death trap, a failed experiment, a fighter so flawed that Western air forces couldn't wait to ship them east. The RAF had rejected it after a handful of missions. The USAF used it only where no alternative existed. Even Soviet pilots initially despised it, this strange American machine with an engine mounted behind the pilot and a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. But Pokryshkin had discovered something the Western Allies never understood. At the altitudes where the Eastern Front's savage air war was fought, between 6,000 and 15,000 feet, the despised Airacobra transformed into a precision instrument of destruction. He rolled inverted and dove, the Allison V-1710 engine roaring behind his head, and lined up a Bf-109 that had just broken from formation. His thumb found the cannon trigger. The 37mm gun, which American pilots complained was too slow firing and carried too little ammunition, spoke once. The German fighter exploded, its wings separating cleanly as the massive shell detonated in the fuel tank. Pokryshkin pulled up, already scanning for his next target. By war's end, he would claim 59 victories, making him the second highest-scoring Allied ace. His weapon of choice, the fighter the West had discarded as worthless, the Bell P-39 Airacobra. This is the story of how the Soviet Union took America's most controversial fighter, a design rejected and mocked by its creators, and transformed it into one of the most effective weapons on the Eastern Front. It's a story of how different wars create different requirements, how tactical doctrine matters more than raw performance, and how 4,700 Airacobras delivered through the treacherous Arctic convoys and Alaskan ferry route became the mount of Soviet legends. It's about how a fighter considered obsolete in the West accounted for the highest number of individual Luftwaffe kills by any American-built aircraft, and why captured German pilots learned to fear the distinctive profile of the Bell fighter more than the celebrated Soviet designs. The P-39's troubled beginning started with one of aviation's most radical design decisions. In 1937, Bell Aircraft Corporation's design team led by Robert Woods proposed mounting a fighter's engine behind the cockpit, connected to the propeller by a 10-foot drive shaft running beneath the pilot's seat. The reasoning was elegant in theory. Placing the engine at the aircraft's centre of gravity would improve manoeuvrability. The empty nose could mount heavy forward-firing armament. The pilot would sit in the ideal position for visibility and centre of gravity, unobstructed by a massive radial engine or complicated inline installation ahead of him. The XP-39 prototype that first flew in April 1939 showed remarkable promise. With a turbo-supercharged Allison V-1710 engine producing 150 horsepower, it reached 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The armament was revolutionary, a 37mm Oldsmobile T9 cannon, essentially a modified anti-tank gun firing through the propeller hub, backed by two synchronized 50-caliber machine guns in the nose and four 30-caliber guns in the wings. Test pilots raved about the handling, the excellent visibility from the car-like cockpit with its automobile-style doors, and the devastating firepower. Then the Army Air Corps made a decision that would haunt the Airacobra's reputation. Concerned about cost, complexity, and reliability, they ordered the turbo supercharger removed. The modification saved £300 and reduced production costs, but it gutted the aircraft's high-altitude performance. Without the turbocharger, the Allison engine's power dropped catastrophically above 12,000 feet. At 20,000 feet, where Western Front air combat increasingly occurred, the P-39 was a struggling, gasping shadow of its prototype performance. The production P-39D that entered service in 1941 was fast at low altitude, reaching 360 miles per hour at sea level, but above 15,000 feet, it became a wallowing pig. Climb rate fell to barely 2,000 feet per minute. Turn performance degraded. German Bf-109s and FW-190s, operating at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, could attack at will, diving on the struggling Airacobras with impunity. American pilots quickly learned to hate it. The 37mm cannon, impressive on paper, proved problematic in practice. It fired slowly, just 140 rounds per minute compared to 600 rounds per minute, for the .50 caliber guns. The entire ammunition load was just 30 rounds, exhausted in seconds of sustained fire. The gun jammed frequently, especially during high-G maneuvers. The recoil, when it did fire, was violent enough to slow the aircraft noticeably and throw off the pilot's aim. Worse, the unconventional design created handling quirks that killed inexperienced pilots. The mid-mounted engine created unusual weight distribution. If the nose-mounted ammunition was expended but the wing gun still had ammo, the centre of gravity shifted dangerously aft. Spins became unrecoverable. The narrow-track landing gear, dictated by the need to retract into the thin wings, made ground handling treacherous. The P-39 ground-looped on landing, torque-rolled on takeoff, and generally did its best to kill student pilots. In the Pacific Theatre, where the USAF desperately needed fighters in 1942, the P-39 faced Japanese Zeros that could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver it at every altitude. Lieutenant Colonel Boyd Wagner, flying P-39s in the Philippines in early 1942, managed to score several victories through aggressive tactics and excellent marksmanship, but he was the exception. Most pilots found themselves hopelessly outmatched. The British were even less impressed. The RAF received 675 Airacobras under Lend-Lease, designated the Airacobra I, No. 601 Squadron, which evaluated the type in 1941, found it so deficient they refused to use it operationally. The climb rate was inadequate. The high-altitude performance was dismal. The armament was unreliable. After a handful of operational sorties that achieved nothing, the RAF withdrew the Airacobra from service and relegated the remaining aircraft to training duties. British test pilots wrote scathing reports. One evaluation concluded that the P-39 was possibly the worst fighter aircraft currently in service with any air force. By mid-1942, the Airacobra's reputation was thoroughly destroyed. American factories were producing them by the hundreds, but neither the USAF nor RAF wanted them. They were obsolete before they entered service, handicapped by the decision to remove the turbo supercharger. Bell Aircraft had other designs in development, including the P-63 King Cobra, but that wouldn't enter production until 1943. In the meantime, thousands of P-39s were coming off the production lines with nowhere to go. Then the Soviet Union entered the equation. Desperate for fighters after catastrophic losses in 1941, the USSR was less concerned with high-altitude performance than with sheer numbers and firepower. The brutal air war on the Eastern Front was fought at altitudes where the P-39's limitations mattered less, and its strengths could shine. The first P-39s reached the Soviet Union in spring 1942 via the dangerous Arctic convoy route to Murmansk and the Alaska-Siberia ferry route through Nome. Soviet pilots approached the strange American fighter with deep skepticism. They were accustomed to Soviet designs like the Yak-1 and LegGG-3, simple, robust aircraft designed for rough field operations and minimal maintenance. The P-39 seemed overcomplicated, with its mid-mounted engine, unusual tricycle landing gear, and car-like cockpit with sideways opening doors. Initial impressions were terrible. Soviet mechanics struggled with the unfamiliar Allison engine and its systems. The oxygen equipment designed for high-altitude operations the Soviets rarely conducted malfunctioned in the extreme cold. The radios were incompatible with Soviet ground stations. The 37mm cannon jammed constantly until armourers figured out that the ammunition needed to be loaded with extreme care, each shell individually inspected and carefully seated. Captain Grigory Reshkalov, who had become the third highest-scoring Soviet ace, recalled his first flight in a P-39. "I thought the Americans had sent us their garbage. The cockpit was cramped. The engine behind me was terrifying. I was certain it would catch fire and cook me alive. The visibility was good, I admitted that, but everything else seemed wrong. On landing, the nose wheel collapsed. I told my commander I would rather fly a LegGG-3, and anyone who knew the LegGG-3 knew that was damning. Criticism. But something unexpected happened as Soviet pilots accumulated hours in the Airacobra. They began discovering its hidden virtues, characteristics that made it ideally suited for the Eastern Front's unique combat environment. The first revelation was altitude. While Western Front air combat routinely occurred at 20,000 to 30,000 feet, Eastern Front engagements rarely exceeded 15,000 feet. Most occurred below 10,000 feet. German fighters supporting ground operations flew low to maintain contact with their targets. Soviet fighters intercepting them operated at similar altitudes. In this environment, the P-39's lack of a turbo supercharger was irrelevant. At 10,000 feet, the Allison engine produced excellent power, and the Airacobra's performance matched or exceeded anything the Luftwaffe could field. Below 12,000 feet, a properly flown P-39 was fast, accelerating to 360 miles per hour quickly. It dove superbly, reaching speeds that allowed Soviet pilots to escape if overwhelmed. Most importantly, it could outturn the Bf-109 at low altitude, something American pilots flying at higher altitudes never discovered. The second revelation was firepower. Once Soviet armorers mastered the temperamental 37mm cannon, it became a devastating weapon. Unlike machine guns that required sustained fire to bring down an aircraft, the 37mm needed just 1 or 2 hits. German pilots who survived encounters described the effect of those massive shells as apocalyptic. A single hit anywhere on a fighter meant instant destruction. Wings separated, fuselages broke in half, engines exploded. Pukrishkin, the master of Airacobra combat, developed a doctrine he called altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. He would climb to 15,000 feet, cruise at high speed, spot targets below, then dive to attack with tremendous energy advantage. One pass, one shot from the 37mm, then zoom back to altitude. German pilots never saw him coming. His wingmen, flying complementary tactics, would engage any Germans who survived the initial pass. The methodology worked spectacularly. Soviet P-39 pilots quickly began running up impressive scores. Pukrishkin's 59 victories made him second only to Ivan Kozyudyub in total kills among Allied aces. Reshkalov, who initially hated the P-39, ended with 56 victories, the vast majority in Airacobras. Nikolai Gulayev scored 55 kills. Arseny Vorozheikin claimed 52. Altogether, at least 20 Soviet aces achieved ace status exclusively or primarily in P-39s. The Soviet love affair with the Airacobra wasn't just about performance, it was about philosophy. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized verticality, energy fighting, and decisive single-pass attacks. The P-39 was perfect for this style. Its excellent low-altitude speed and acceleration, good dive characteristics, and devastating cannon armament matched Soviet tactics perfectly. Contrast this with Western doctrine, which emphasized sustained turning combat, long chases, and multiple firing passes with machine guns. The P-39 was terrible at this style of fighting. Its limited ammunition, slow-firing cannon, and modest sustained turn rate made it poorly suited for Western tactics. The same aircraft, flown according to different tactical doctrine, produced completely different results. The Germans quickly learned to fear the Cobra, their name for the P-39. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from 1943 warned pilots that Soviet P-39s were highly dangerous below 15,000 feet, that the large cannon could destroy any German aircraft with a single hit, and that Cobra pilots were typically experienced and aggressive. Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, who would become the highest scoring ace in history with 352 victories, recalled an encounter with P-39s in 1943. "I attacked what I thought was an easy target, a lone American-built fighter low over the front lines. He saw me coming and turned hard. I was flying a Bf-109 G2, which should have outturned anything. He stayed with me. I reversed. He reversed inside me. I tried to extend away, but he was accelerating as fast as I was. Then that cannon fired. I saw the muzzle flash from his propeller hub and knew I was dead. By pure luck, he missed. The shell went past my canopy close enough that I felt the shock wave. I disengaged using every bit of speed my fighter had. Later, I learned it was a Cobra. I never underestimated them again." Soviet pilots appreciated other aspects of the P-39 that Western pilots overlooked. The cockpit, cramped by American standards, was spacious compared to Soviet fighters. The visibility was superb with large windows and minimal obstruction. The radio, once adapted to Soviet frequencies, worked reliably. The heater, a luxury in Soviet fighters, made winter operations tolerable. The armor protection, including a 1.5-inch thick laminated glass windscreen and steel plate behind the pilot's seat, saved countless lives. Most significantly, the tricycle landing gear was a revelation. Soviet pilots were accustomed to tailwheel fighters that required careful ground handling, and offered no forward visibility during taxi. The P-39's nose wheel allowed pilots to see where they were going on the ground, made takeoffs and landings dramatically safer, and reduced ground accidents. This was critical for the Soviet Air Force, which operated from rough forward airstrips where ground loops in conventional gear aircraft killed dozens of pilots. The mid-mounted engine, initially terrifying to Soviet pilots, proved safer than expected. Engine fires, when they occurred, generally didn't threaten the pilot as directly as nose-mounted engine fires. Battle damage to the engine rarely resulted in cockpit fires. The long drive shaft occasionally failed, but such failures were usually survivable, the propeller windmilling freely while the pilot landed dead stick. By late 1943, Soviet units were specifically requesting P-39s. Elite Guards fighter regiments equipped with Airacobras became the tip of the spear, assigned to critical sectors and given priority for experienced pilots. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, flying exclusively P-39s, produced 18 heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest Soviet military honor. The 9th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, also equipped with Airacobras, counted 7 heroes of the Soviet Union among its pilots. The Soviet Union ultimately received 4,119 P-39s of various models, more than any other Lend-Lease fighter type. These aircraft represented roughly 1/3 of Bell's total Airacobra production. While Americans and British discarded the type as quickly as possible, Soviets were asking for more. The logistics of delivering thousands of fighters to the Soviet Union were staggering. 2 routes dominated. The Arctic convoys sailed from Britain and America to Murmansk, braving German U-boats, bombers, and surface raiders in the deadly waters north of Norway. Dozens of merchant ships were sunk, taking their cargoes of fighters, tanks, and supplies to the bottom. Those that survived delivered P-39s in crates, which Soviet workers assembled under brutal conditions in facilities near the port. The Alaska-Siberia ferry route was even more remarkable. American pilots flew fighters from Montana to Fairbanks, Alaska, then turned them over to Soviet pilots who flew them across the Bering Strait and through Siberia to the European front, a journey of 8,000 miles through some of the harshest weather on Earth. Soviet ferry pilots, many of them women, flew this route in open cockpits during Arctic winter, navigating by landmarks and dead reckoning, landing at primitive airstrips carved from tundra. Dozens died in crashes, frozen in cockpits, or lost in whiteouts. Once in Soviet service, P-39s were modified to suit local conditions. Soviet mechanics removed weight wherever possible, stripping out unnecessary equipment. The wing-mounted 30 caliber machine guns, considered inadequate by Soviet standards, were often removed entirely, saving weight and simplifying maintenance. Some units replaced the 37mm cannon with a 20mm weapon that had higher rate of fire and more ammunition, though most pilots preferred the 37mm's devastating hitting power. Soviet armourers developed specialised ammunition loads. They discovered that high-explosive incendiary rounds for the 37mm cannon were far more effective than the armour-piercing rounds the Americans had provided. The HE rounds, designed for ground attack, proved devastatingly effective against aircraft, detonating on contact and creating massive damage. A single hit from an HE 37mm shell could tear a wing off a Bf-109. The 50 caliber machine guns in the nose were loaded with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition exclusively. Soviet pilots developed a technique of firing the machine guns first to walk rounds onto the target, then firing the cannon when the machine gun tracers showed they were on target. This conserved the precious 30 rounds of 37mm ammunition while maintaining effectiveness. Winter operations revealed another P-39 advantage. The liquid-cooled Allison engine, properly maintained, started reliably in extreme cold. Soviet mechanics developed elaborate preheating procedures, but once started, the engine ran smoothly at temperatures that defeated air-cooled radials. The enclosed cockpit and effective heater kept pilots comfortable during long winter patrols, reducing fatigue and cold-related performance degradation. The Germans responded to the P-39 threat with tactical adjustments. Luftwaffe doctrine advised avoiding combat below 15,000 feet when Cobras were present. If combat was unavoidable, German pilots were instructed to never turn with a P-39 at low altitude, to always maintain energy advantage, and to disengage immediately if the Cobra pilot appeared experienced. These tactics worked when German pilots could implement them. but the Eastern Front's chaotic close air support environment often forced engagements at low altitude where the P-39 excelled. German fighters attacking Soviet ground troops had to descend into the Cobra's killing zone. Soviet fighters defending against German attacks operated at altitudes where the P-39 was competitive or superior. The statistics tell a compelling story. Soviet pilots flying P-39s claim thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed. While exact numbers are disputed due to overclaiming common to all air forces, German records confirm heavy losses to Soviet fighters in sectors where P-39 units operated. The P-39 accounted for more individual Luftwaffe kills than any other American-built fighter, more than the P-38, more than the P-51, more even than the celebrated P-47. Individual pilots' achievements in the Airacobra were remarkable. Pushkin, the master tactician, flew 650 combat sorties, engaged in 156 aerial combats, and claimed 59 personal victories plus 6 shared. His tactical innovations were studied throughout the Soviet Air Force and influenced Soviet fighter doctrine for decades. Rechkalov, who initially despised the P-39, transformed his opinion after mastering its quirks. He claimed 56 victories, 50 of them in Airacobras. His combat report from July 1943 described an engagement typical of effective P-39 employment. Encountered 6 Bf-109s at 8,000 meters attacking our ground forces. I dove from 10,000 meters, building speed to 600 kilometers per hour, selected the lead aircraft and opened fire with machine guns at 400 meters, observed strikes on fuselage and wings. At 200 meters, fired cannon. Single shell struck near cockpit. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. Used speed from dive to zoom back to altitude. Entire attack lasted 4 seconds. Enemy formation scattered. 2 additional victories achieved by wingmen. This was textbook P-39 combat as practiced by Soviet experts. High-speed diving attack, brief concentrated fire, devastating results, immediate disengagement. No. Turning combat, no drawn-out dogfight, no sustained firing. 1 pass, 1 kill, climb back to altitude. The P-39 was perfect for this methodology. Nikolai Gulayev, with 55 victories, was known for aggressive close-range attacks. He would close to within 100 meters before firing, ensuring the 37mm cannon's single shot would be decisive. His aircraft bore the scars of dozens of engagements, damaged repeatedly by debris from aircraft he destroyed at such close range. He survived the war and continued flying P-39s in the Soviet Air Force until 1948. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment's history illustrated the Airacobra's impact. Equipped with P-39s from 1943, the regiment claimed over 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed while losing 27 pilots killed. The kill-to-loss ratio, while inflated by overclaiming, demonstrated that properly employed P-39s could dominate their sector of the front. Not all Soviet pilots loved the Airacobra. Some preferred the nimble Yak-3, others the powerful Lavochkin-Layavan. But even critics acknowledged that in the right hands, the P-39 was devastatingly effective. The debate wasn't whether it was a good fighter, but whether it was the best fighter for Soviet conditions. The P-39's reputation in Soviet service created a bizarre situation. In the West, it was considered obsolete, a failure, a fighter so bad that it was shipped to the Soviets simply to get rid of it. In the East, it was prized, sought after by elite units, the mount of heroes. Same aircraft, completely different reputation. This disparity revealed fundamental truths about fighter design and employment. Performance specifications on paper meant little without proper tactical doctrine. An aircraft's effectiveness depended on how and where it was used, who flew it, and what tactics they employed. The P-39 was a terrible fighter for high-altitude bomber escort over Germany. It was an excellent fighter for low-altitude combat over the Eastern Front. Same aircraft, different war. American test pilots who flew P-39s after the war, with the benefit of Soviet tactical knowledge, came to appreciate what Soviet pilots had discovered. Flown correctly, the P-39 below 15,000 feet was competitive with any fighter of its era. The problem wasn't the aircraft, it was that Western air forces were fighting a different war at different altitudes with different tactics. The Luftwaffe's assessment of the Airacobra evolved throughout the war. Early reports from 1942 dismissed it as inferior to German fighters. By 1943, Intelligence bulletins warned that Soviet P-39s were dangerous and should be respected. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots considered Cobra-equipped units as serious threats as any Soviet fighter regiment. German pilot accounts from late war confirm this respect. Lieutenant Hans Rosbach, who flew Bs 109 G6s on the Eastern Front, wrote in his diary in September 1944, "We encountered P-39s today over Riga. They were above us, unusual, as they typically operate, lower. Before we could react, they dove. The speed was tremendous. My swarm leader was hit before he could turn. The distinctive cannon shell tore his fighter apart. I dove for the ground, hoping to use my Gustav's better high-altitude performance in reverse, but the Cobra followed me down easily. Only frantic maneuvering and the intervention of my wingman saved me. These are not the easy victories we were promised." The psychological impact of the 37mm cannon cannot be overstated. German pilots knew that a single hit meant certain death. Machine guns and even 20mm cannon often required multiple hits to bring down a fighter, giving pilots time to evade or return fire. The 37mm eliminated that margin for error. One hit, instant destruction. This knowledge affected German pilots' willingness to press attacks when P-39s were present. Soviet ground forces appreciated the P-39 as well, particularly in the ground attack role. While not designed as a dedicated ground attack aircraft, the 37mm cannon proved effective against lightly armoured vehicles, bunkers, and troop concentrations. Soviet pilots developed dive bombing techniques, attacking ground targets at steep angles and pulling out at low altitude, using the P-39's good dive characteristics and strong airframe. The P-39's contribution to Soviet victory is difficult to quantify precisely. Overclaiming was rampant on all sides, Soviet records are incomplete or unreliable, and German loss records don't always specify which Allied fighter type achieved the kill. But the qualitative evidence is clear. Soviet pilots who flew P-39s believed it was an excellent fighter. They achieved impressive scores. German pilots learned to fear it. Elite Soviet units requested it specifically. By contrast, P-39s in American service achieved far less. The type was withdrawn from Frontline USAF service by mid-1944, relegated to training and defense duties. American pilots who flew it in combat generally disliked it. The few American aces who scored victories in P-39s did so despite the aircraft, not because of it. This disparity has been explained various ways. Some argue Soviet pilots were more skilled, though this seems unlikely given American training advantages. Others suggest Soviet overclaiming explains the difference, but German records confirm heavy losses in sectors where P-39 units operated. The most convincing explanation is tactical. Soviet doctrine matched the aircraft's strengths, while American doctrine exposed its weaknesses. The P-39 remained in Soviet service after the war, flying with units until 1949 when jet fighters finally replaced it. Some Soviet pilots who transitioned to early jets like the Yak-15 and MiG-9 complained that the new fighters lacked the P-39's devastating cannon firepower and robust construction. The Airacobra had set a standard for hitting power that early jets struggled to match. Post-war, when the Cold War descended and Soviet-American cooperation ended, the Airacobra's story became politicized. Soviet historians emphasized indigenous aircraft like the Yak-3 and Lay-7, downplaying Lend-Lease contributions. American historians, embarrassed by the P-39's failure in Western service, emphasized aircraft like the P-51 and P-47. The Airacobra's incredible success in Soviet hands was largely forgotten in both countries. Only in recent decades, as archives opened and veterans' accounts became available, has the full story emerged. The P-39 wasn't a failure. It was a fighter optimized for a specific type of combat that Western air forces weren't fighting, but the Soviets were. In its proper environment, flown according to tactics that exploited its strengths, the Airacobra was as effective as any Allied fighter. The irony is profound. Bell Aircraft designed an innovative fighter with radical features. The US Army removed the turbo-supercharger, crippling its high-altitude performance. American pilots forced to fly it in roles it wasn't suited for hated it. The RAF rejected it entirely, but Soviet pilots, fighting a different war at different altitudes, discovered that the discarded American fighter was nearly perfect for their needs. The Bell P-39 Airacobra served throughout the war in Soviet colours, from the desperate defensive battles of 1942 through the triumphant advance to Berlin in 1945. It armed elite guards regiments, carried aces to incredible scores, and struck fear into Luftwaffe pilots who learned to respect the distinctive profile and devastating cannon. At war's end, Pokryshkin, Rechkalov, Gulayev, and dozens of other P-39 aces were celebrated heroes of the Soviet Union. Their American-built fighters, scorned in the West, had proven themselves in the crucible of the Eastern Front's savage air war. The flying reject of Western air forces had become the Soviet Union's most successful foreign fighter. Today, preserved P-39s sit in museums worldwide. The placards describe an interesting but flawed design, a failed experiment, an aircraft whose combat record was undistinguished. What they rarely mention is that in Soviet hands this supposed failure achieved more aerial victories than any other American-built fighter, that Soviet aces loved it, that German pilots feared it, that 4,700 Airacobras helped turn the tide of the greatest air war in history. The P-39 Airacobra was mocked in the West and dominated in the East, proof that in warfare doctrine matters as much as design, that the same weapon can be worthless or invaluable depending on how it's employed, and that sometimes the reject becomes the champion when given to pilots who understand how to use it. The laughter that greeted the strange mid-engine fighter in American and British squadrons never reached the Eastern Front, where the sound of that 37mm cannon meant death had come calling for the Luftwaffe. The tactical innovations Soviet pilots developed around the P-39 were studied and refined throughout 1943 and 1944, creating a body of doctrine that would influence Soviet fighter tactics for decades. The vertical fighting techniques pioneered by Pokryshkin and his contemporaries became standard teaching at Soviet flight schools. Student pilots were instructed never to engage in horizontal turning fights when flying aircraft with superior vertical performance, a lesson learned directly from P-39 combat experience. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Babak, who flew with the 100th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, described the transformation in Soviet thinking that the Airacobra enabled. Before the Cobra, we fought like our enemies, turning and twisting at medium altitude, trying to outmaneuver them. The P-39 taught us to fight three-dimensionally. We learned to treat altitude as stored energy, to convert height to speed in attacks, then convert speed back to altitude in escapes. The Germans couldn't follow us through these vertical maneuvers. Their fighters were optimized for horizontal combat. Ours, at least the American ones, excelled vertically. It changed everything. This vertical fighting doctrine required different pilot skills than traditional dogfighting. Energy management became paramount. Pilots had to understand airspeed versus altitude trades, how to maintain energy through maneuvers, when to engage and when to extend. The P-39's good acceleration and excellent dive characteristics rewarded pilots who mastered these concepts, while punishing those who tried to fight conventionally. Soviet training evolved to emphasize these skills. Student pilots spent hours practicing zoom climbs, learning to convert dive speed into altitude gain. They practiced high-speed gunnery, shooting at targets while diving at 400 miles per hour. They learned deflection shooting at extreme angles, necessary because vertical attacks often meant firing at crossing targets rather than tail chases. The washout rate increased. Many students couldn't master the demanding techniques, but those who succeeded became lethal. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment's training program became the model for P-39 units throughout the Soviet Air Force. New pilots arriving at the regiment spent 2 weeks in intensive ground school, learning the Allison engine's quirks, the 37mm cannon's characteristics, and the proper techniques for vertical combat. Then came flight training, initially solo to master the aircraft's handling, then 2 ship formations practicing mutual support, finally full regiment exercises against experienced pilots playing the role of German fighters. Only after this preparation were new pilots allowed on combat missions, and even then only as wingmen to experienced leaders. The Soviets couldn't afford the cavalier approach American units sometimes took, throwing inexperienced pilots into combat with minimal preparation. Soviet resources were too constrained, replacement pilots too valuable. Every pilot had to be effective quickly, or the unit's combat power suffered. This careful preparation paid dividends. P-39 units had lower loss rates than many Soviet fighter regiments flying indigenous aircraft. The combination of proper training, sound tactics, and an aircraft well suited to the mission created highly effective combat units. German intelligence identified specific P-39 regiments as dangerous opponents to be avoided when possible. The maintenance burden of operating P-39s presented constant challenges. Soviet mechanics, trained on simple, robust Soviet designs, struggled with the complex American fighter. The Allison engine required precise maintenance procedures. The reduction gearbox connecting the long drive shaft to the propeller was temperamental, requiring careful inspection and frequent replacement of bearings. The 37mm cannon demanded meticulous cleaning and care of the ammunition feed mechanism. Soviet maintenance depots developed specialized procedures for Airacobra upkeep. Experienced mechanics who understood the American systems became invaluable, often traveling between units to train less experienced personnel. Captured German mechanics who had worked on American aircraft were sometimes pressed into service, their expertise too valuable to waste despite political complications. Spare parts presented another challenge. Parts shipped from America often arrived damaged or incomplete. Soviet factories attempted to manufacture replacements for commonly failed components, but American and Soviet manufacturing standards differed enough that domestically produced parts sometimes didn't fit properly. Units hoarded spare parts jealously, knowing that a grounded P-39 waiting for parts was worthless. Despite these difficulties, Soviet P-39 units maintained impressive serviceability rates. Guards regiments routinely kept 70 to 80% of their fighters operational, comparable to or better than units flying Soviet aircraft. The dedication of mechanics working in primitive conditions with limited resources deserves recognition equal to the pilots who flew combat missions. Winter operations tested both machines and men. At 40 degrees below zero, common on the Eastern Front, metal became brittle, lubricants froze solid, and rubber seals cracked. The P-39's enclosed cockpit and effective heater kept pilots alive during hours-long patrols, but starting the engine in extreme cold required elaborate procedures. Mechanics would preheat the engine cowling with portable heaters for 30 minutes, then heat the oil separately before attempting to start. Even then, the engine often refused to fire until temperatures rose slightly. Once running, the Allison generally operated reliably in cold conditions, better than some Soviet radial engines that suffered oil circulation problems in extreme cold. The liquid cooling system, properly maintained with correct antifreeze mixtures, didn't freeze. Soviet mechanics learned to drain coolant after each flight and refill before the next mission, time-consuming but necessary to prevent frozen coolant from cracking the engine block. German pilots operating against P-39s developed their own counter-tactics. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized avoiding combat at low altitude where Cobras excelled, but operational realities often made this impossible. When forced to fight at low altitude, German pilots tried to use their fighters' better sustained turn rates to force extended turning engagements where the P-39's energy fighting advantages were negated. This worked against inexperienced Soviet pilots who could be baited into prolonged dogfights. But experienced P-39 pilots refused to take the bait. They would extend away from turning fights, zoom back to altitude, then attack again from above with energy advantage restored. German fighters trying to follow them into zoom climbs found themselves stalling out while the P-39 continued climbing, presenting an easy target. Hauptmann Heinz Baer, a Luftwaffe ace with 220 victories, described the frustration of fighting P-39s. You shoot at them and they dive away faster than you can follow. You chase them in the dive, but they're already gone, accelerating away. You try to climb back to altitude and they're above you again somehow, diving down for another attack. That cannon only has to hit you once and you're finished. They know it, so they're patient. They'll make 10 diving attacks if necessary, waiting for the one clean shot that ends the fight. It's maddening, facing an enemy who refuses to fight on your terms and has the performance to dictate the engagement. The psychological advantage of the 37mm cannon extended beyond its destructive power. German pilots knew they faced instant death from a single hit, creating stress that degraded performance. Soviet pilots, knowing they possessed this devastating weapon, flew with confidence bordering on aggression. This psychological dynamic influenced combat outcomes independent of raw performance numbers. Soviet propaganda exploited P-39 successes relentlessly. Pakryshkin became a national hero, his face on posters, his tactics taught in schools, his victories celebrated in newsreels. The fact that he flew an American aircraft was mentioned but not emphasized. Soviet propagandists focused on Soviet pilots' skill and bravery, treating the P-39 as merely a tool in capable hands rather than a significant contributor to success. This propaganda served multiple purposes. It boosted morale by celebrating heroes, it demonstrated that Soviet pilots could match or exceed German opponents, and it subtly downplayed Lend-Lease contributions, maintaining the narrative that the Soviet Union was winning the war primarily through its own efforts. The P-39's success was attributed to Soviet pilots rather than American engineering. American officials, meanwhile, were largely unaware of how successful the P-39 was in Soviet service. Communication between allies was limited. Soviet combat reports rarely reached American intelligence, and American attention focused on their own operations in Western Europe and the Pacific. The few American observers who reached Soviet P-39 units filed reports noting high pilot morale and claims of impressive victory scores, but these reports were often dismissed as Soviet exaggeration. This mutual incomprehension meant that lessons learned in Soviet P-39 service never reached American pilots flying the same aircraft. American P-39 units continued using tactics developed for high-altitude combat, tactics that exposed the aircraft's weaknesses. Soviet vertical fighting techniques, which exploited the P-39's strengths, remained unknown in the West throughout the war. The introduction of improved P-39 variants enhanced Soviet capabilities. The P-39N, arriving in late 1943, featured an upgraded Allison V17-1085 engine producing 200 horsepower and improved armor protection. The P-39Q, the final major production variant, incorporated all previous improvements plus provisions for external fuel tanks that extended range significantly. Soviet pilots appreciated these improvements, though they noted that the basic P-39 design's strengths remained unchanged. Some Soviet units experimented with field modifications beyond standard factory changes. A few regiments removed all armament except the 37mm cannon and two 50-caliber machine guns, saving weight that improved climb and acceleration. Others added additional armor around the cockpit, accepting the performance penalty for increased pilot protection. These modifications were rarely officially sanctioned, but commanders tolerated them when pilots demonstrated improved effectiveness. The most successful P-39 pilots developed personal techniques that maximized the aircraft's unique characteristics. Reshkalov preferred diving attacks from high altitude, building tremendous speed that made deflection shooting nearly impossible for defending Germans. Gulaev favored lower altitude attacks with extremely close firing range, accepting the risk of debris strikes to ensure single-shot kills. Pokrishkin used a combination approach, varying his tactics based on enemy formation, altitude, and tactical situation. These individual approaches highlighted an important aspect of fighter combat. The best pilots adapted their aircraft to personal strengths, rather than flying according to rigid doctrine. The P-39's characteristics enabled multiple tactical approaches. Pilots could emphasize speed, firepower, or maneuverability depending on personal preference. This flexibility was itself a strength, allowing capable pilots to develop fighting styles that matched their skills. German tactical intelligence compiled detailed analyses of Soviet P-39 units, identifying specific regiments, their typical tactics, and their most dangerous pilots. These intelligence reports warned German pilots which sectors contained P-39 units and advised avoiding combat in those areas when possible. The Germans rated some P-39-equipped Guards regiments as more dangerous than units flying the latest Soviet fighters, a remarkable testament to both the aircraft and the pilots who flew it. The strategic impact of P-39s extended beyond individual combats. The presence of effective Soviet fighters complicated German air operations throughout the Eastern Front. Luftwaffe fighters tasked with ground attack or bomber escort had to maintain defensive vigilance against Soviet interceptors. This reduced effectiveness, forcing Germans to allocate fighters to escort duties rather than offensive operations. The operational freedom that the Luftwaffe had enjoyed in 1941 and early 1942 was gone by 1943, in part because of increasingly capable Soviet fighter units equipped with aircraft like the P-39. Soviet air superiority over critical sectors of the front, achieved by 1944, owed much to P-39 units. These regiments, equipped with reliable aircraft and flown by experienced pilots using effective tactics, dominated their assigned areas. German aircraft operating in these sectors did so at extreme risk, enabling Soviet ground forces to operate with minimal air threat. This air superiority contributed directly to Soviet ground offensives that drove German forces westward. The P-39's ground attack capabilities, while secondary to its fighter role, proved valuable during major offensives. The 37mm cannon could destroy light armoured vehicles, trucks and trains with single shots. Soviet pilots developed skip bombing techniques, approaching targets at low altitude and bouncing bombs into vehicles or buildings. While dedicated ground attack aircraft like the Il-2 Sturmovik carried heavier ordnance, P-39s provided flexible fire support while maintaining the ability to defend themselves against German fighters. During Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive in summer 1944 that destroyed German Army Group Center, P-39 units provided continuous air cover and ground attack support. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment flew over 400 sorties during the operation's first week, claiming 87 air victories and destroying numerous ground targets. Whether these numbers were accurate matters less than the operational effect. German forces in the sector faced constant air attack, while their own air support was swept from the sky. The logistical achievement of sustaining thousands of P-39s in Soviet service deserves emphasis. Beyond initial delivery, each aircraft required continuous supply of spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and lubricants. The 37mm ammunition, not manufactured in the Soviet Union, had to be shipped from America. Each P-39 consumed hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel monthly, fuel that had to be transported thousands of miles from refineries to frontline airstrips. Soviet logistics personnel performed miracles keeping P-39 units supplied. Supply convoys traveling primitive roads under constant air attack delivered the material that kept fighters flying. Maintenance depots near the front repaired damaged aircraft, often working without proper facilities or tools. Ammunition handlers loaded 37mm shells into aircraft in driving snow or summer heat, each round carefully inspected because a single malfunction could jam the gun in combat. This logistical web extended across continents. American factories produced aircraft and parts. Ships carried them across dangerous oceans. Soviet workers assembled crated aircraft or processed arriving parts. Trucks moved everything forward to operational units. Mechanics installed parts and loaded ammunition. Pilots flew combat missions. The entire system had to function smoothly, or the combat capability of P-39 units degraded. That it worked at all was remarkable. That it worked well enough to sustain major combat operations for 3 years was extraordinary. The human cost of P-39 operations is difficult to calculate precisely. Soviet records are incomplete and often unreliable. Hundreds of Soviet pilots died flying P-39s, shot down in combat, killed in accidents, or lost to mechanical failures. Each death represented years of training and combat experience the Soviet Air Force could ill afford to lose. Yet P-39 units maintained their strength through continuous replacement of losses with newly trained pilots. The American pilots who died ferrying P-39s to Alaska, and the Soviet pilots who died flying them across Siberia, deserve recognition. These ferry operations were dangerous, conducted in terrible weather over hostile terrain with minimal navigation aids. Dozens of aircraft and their pilots were lost, crashing in remote areas where rescue was impossible. Some wreckage wasn't discovered for decades. German pilots killed by P-39s numbered in the thousands. Each represented training, experience, and skill that Germany desperately needed. The systematic attrition of Luftwaffe fighter strength on the Eastern Front, to which P-39s contributed significantly, crippled German air defences elsewhere. Experienced pilots transferred from the Eastern Front to defend Germany against Allied bombing brought with them respect for Soviet capabilities and awareness that the war was being lost. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 found hundreds of P-39s still in Soviet service. These aircraft participated in the final offensives into Germany and the occupation that followed. Soviet pilots flew victory patrols over Berlin in their American fighters, symbols of the alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany. Within months, as the Cold War began, these same aircraft would be viewed with suspicion. American technology in Soviet hands now seen as potential threat rather than Allied cooperation. The Soviet Union's request for continued P-39 deliveries after the German surrender was denied. American production had ended in May 1944, with Bell shifting to P-63 production. The aircraft the Soviets had prized was no longer being manufactured and existing. American stocks were being scrapped as quickly as possible. The era of American fighters in Soviet service was ending, replaced by indigenous jet designs and the beginning of the arms race. P-39s remained in Soviet service until 1949, gradually replaced by newer aircraft. Some were transferred to satellite nations. Poland and Yugoslavia received small numbers of refurbished P-39s. Others were scrapped, the aluminum recycled. A few were preserved as monuments or museum pieces, recognition of their wartime service. Most simply disappeared, worn out after years of hard use. The veterans who had flown P-39s in combat carried their memories into the post-war era. Pokryshkin became a Soviet Air Force general, his tactical innovations taught to new generations of pilots. Rechkalov transitioned to jets, becoming a test pilot. Gulayev commanded fighter units. These men and hundreds of others owed their survival and success, in part to the despised American fighter that Western pilots had rejected. In America, the P-39's reputation never recovered. Aviation historians writing in the 1950s and 1960s described it as a failure, an interesting but flawed design that achieved little in combat. The Soviet successes were unknown or dismissed as propaganda. American test pilots who flew preserved P-39s confirmed its poor high-altitude performance and difficult handling, reinforcing the negative reputation. The aircraft became a footnote in American aviation history, overshadowed by the celebrated P-51s, P-47s and P-38s. Only with the opening of Soviet archives after the Cold War did Western historians begin to appreciate the P-39's true combat record. Soviet documents, pilot memoirs and combat reports revealed that the maligned American fighter had been one of the most successful Allied aircraft on the Eastern Front. The aces who flew it, the victories they claimed, and the German respect for the type forced a reassessment of the Airacobra's place in history. Modern analysis recognizes that the P-39 was neither a failure nor a miracle weapon. It was an aircraft optimized for specific combat conditions that happened to match Eastern Front requirements perfectly. Its low-altitude performance was excellent. Its firepower was devastating. Its handling, once mastered, was acceptable. In the right tactical environment, flown by well-trained pilots using appropriate doctrine, it was highly effective. In the wrong environment, at high altitude against tactically superior opponents, it was mediocre at best. This understanding reveals broader lessons about military technology. Performance specifications matter less than matching capabilities to mission requirements. The fastest or most maneuverable fighter isn't necessarily the best for every situation. Training and tactics can overcome significant technical limitations. Industrial capacity matters as much as individual weapon quality. The P-39 illustrated all these principles, the Soviet ability to take a rejected Western fighter and transform it into an effective weapon demonstrated impressive tactical flexibility. Rather than forcing the aircraft to conform to existing doctrine, Soviet pilots adapted their tactics to exploit its strengths. This willingness to innovate, to discard conventional wisdom when reality demanded, gave the Soviet Air Force a crucial advantage. The Germans, wedded to traditional fighter tactics, never fully adapted to the P-39's challenge. The story of the P-39 in Soviet service challenges comfortable narratives. American technology transferred to Soviet allies proved highly effective, contradicting claims that Soviet success came only from crude but numerous indigenous weapons. Soviet pilots proved capable of mastering complex American aircraft and developing sophisticated tactics, contradicting stereotypes of Soviet military rigidity. The Western Allies' rejected fighter became an Eastern Front champion, proving that context determines capability. For the German pilots who faced P-39s, the experience left lasting impressions. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe veterans consistently rated Soviet P-39 units among the most dangerous opponents. The combination of devastating firepower, good low-altitude performance, and aggressive, well-trained pilots created a threat that German fighters struggled to counter. Some veterans expressed relief that they had never faced P-39s equipped with turbo superchargers. wondering how much more dangerous the aircraft might have been with good high-altitude performance. The legacy of the P-39 in Soviet service influenced post-war Soviet fighter design. The emphasis on heavy cannon armament carried through to jets like the MiG-15, which mounted a 37mm cannon similar to the P-39's weapon. The focus on vertical fighting tactics learned with the Airacobra remained standard Soviet doctrine. The understanding that Western performance standards and combat requirements differed from Soviet needs informed design priorities for decades. In recent years, warbird enthusiasts have restored several P-39s to flying condition, including aircraft recovered from remote Soviet crash sites. These flying examples demonstrate the aircraft's handling characteristics, confirming both its challenging nature and its capabilities when properly flown. Pilots checking out in restored P-39s consistently note that the aircraft demands respect and skill, but rewards those who master it with excellent performance within its limitations. The handful of P-39s preserved in Russian museums are treated with honor, recognized as important contributors to victory. Veterans organizations include P-39 pilots among their heroes. The aircraft that America discarded is remembered with respect in the nation where it found its proper role. This historical irony, a failure in one context becoming a success in another, encapsulates the complex story of military technology transfer and adaptation. The Bell P-39 Airacobra entered service mocked by those who designed and built it, rejected by those for whom it was intended, and shipped east to allies who initially shared Western skepticism. In Soviet hands, flown at altitudes where it excelled, using tactics that exploited its strengths, armed with a cannon whose power German pilots learned to fear, it became one of the war's most effective fighters. The transformation from laughingstock to legend took just 2 years, proof that wars are won not just by superior weapons, but by matching weapons to missions and developing tactics that maximize capabilities while minimizing weaknesses. The final word belongs to Pokrishkin, the ace of aces who flew the P-39 to glory. In a 1985 interview shortly before his death, he was asked about the American fighter that had been his mount through years of combat. His response captured the aircraft's paradoxical nature. The Airacobra was a strange machine, uncomfortable at first, difficult to master. But once you understood it, once you learned to fight vertically and use that magnificent cannon, it became a precision instrument. I trusted it completely. It brought me home from 650 missions. It helped me survive when so many friends died. The Americans didn't want it, the British rejected it, but we knew its value. Sometimes the weapon no one wants is exactly what you need. The Germans certainly learned that lesson. They laughed at the Cobra in 1942. They weren't laughing by 1945. The survivors respected it, feared it even. That cannon's sound meant death, and they knew it. As for me, I owed my life to that American fighter. I would fly it into combat tomorrow if I could, because I know what it can do in the right hands.